Hi guys, Claudia Boleyn here. Hopefully the setup is a little bit better. The quality's going to improve a little bit. You're on my Mac, so I hope that works for you. The angle's a bit different. So I wasn't quite sure what to title this video. I had a lot of thoughts about it. And I kind of wanted to discuss the Nazi incident with Harry where he wore the Nazi costume in 2005. And I kind of wanted to get into a conversation about growth and maybe follow some of Harry's journey, which has taken him to a point where he now considers himself to be an anti-racist and speaks out against racism. So I think what we're looking at with Harry, and which I've been really interested in for a while, if you've seen some of my old videos before I even got onto this, I think there is huge value in looking at people who come from places where racism is the norm. They have those biases, and I think that there are different sorts of racism out there, and I think that's why it's so difficult to be rid of racism, because so many people think that racism simply means like an ill intent and deliberately saying something overtly racist. But obviously we live in systems and societies of white supremacy where we are going to have bias, even people who don't think they're biased. And we also live in a society where sometimes the accusation of racism, when made to a white person, can feel to them more painful and like more of a vicious attack than how racism feels to people of colour, because you get this kind of defensive reaction where when you see, like, for example, you see academics, people of colour talking about their experiences and talking about white supremacy and the ways in which they've been stereotyped or repressed, you'll get certain white people who can't get past the feeling of anger as if they've been personally attacked, by having their behaviour called out or having their beliefs questioned. You'll get certain people who go that way, but then you'll also, really interestingly, and what gives me a lot of hope in society, is that you'll also have people from the privileged group who, when they start to realise these biases and these systems, rather than getting defensive and saying, no, not me, not going to address it, and then turning it back on people of colour, you get people who actually do learn. And I feel like nobody chooses their family and their situation. I'm a big believer in that, especially when we're kids. So when we're kids, the people we are brought up around, our morals, our sense of right or wrong, the way we deal with conflict, that's so informed by how we grow up. And that's why I do believe in change and growth, because I think the mark of a person is their adult decisions, and once they understand these things, what they then choose to do. I often think that people oughtn't be judged necessarily by their mistake or their mistakes, but what happened after the mistake. And I think that's, in my view, that's how we move forward, because how did that person learn? Did they reflect? So Harry is this fascinating example, kind of against his will, because he was made a public figure against his will, of somebody who was brought up in an environment which, the system itself is all about, it's built on imperialism and colonialism. That's the history of the institution, that's the history of the firm. What we see with Harry is quite miraculous, these set of circumstances, which is Harry, potentially Diana trying to connect Harry and William more to other people and their experiences, maybe because she tried to teach them to reach out to others. I'm going to get to this in the video. I think there's an important strategic reason why the royals or the firm want to keep the members of the main family isolated from other people in society. I think that distance is key, and I think this is the danger that Diana posed to the firm, which is that once you start down that line of telling people in a monarchy, in a hereditary birthright monarchy, that actually they're not better than other people, they're just different, and perhaps they should get more involved with the people and be closer to them. Once you start hugging people and holding their hands and getting into their struggles, which is what Diana started to do, you're going to eventually hit that situation. And it was always going to happen where someone down the line, those views were going to grow and grow until somebody actually realised, wait, the system's wrong. But Harry slipped the net, quite by accident, by mistake, through a mixture of tragedy that's kind of passed through the family, the way his mother tried to make things slightly different for her boys, the fact that he lost his mother. I think the fact that Harry was the spare is very important in this situation, because I think William is more heavily monitored. I think they lived in different sorts of abusive hell and high stress. But I think although Harry felt a lot of kind of maybe emotional neglect and like he was second best and like he had to step back, they're also maybe not watching him quite as closely. And through their neglect of Harry, through their awful system, I think the monarchy might have accidentally destroyed itself. And I think this began with the way that they treated Diana, because it was always going to happen. If it wasn't Harry, it would be somebody else. But they created the absolute perfect storm. He's not so monitored, he's taught to step back, he's being raised as a new sort of modern royal, which is kind of half in touch with the people, half not. Harry is accidentally kind of given the values of solidarity and community, while sort of being cursed to live in a system which goes against those ideas. I can understand why they had to destroy Diana. It was evil what they did to Diana. But in terms of a business and a firm, I think they realised the moment people started thinking with empathy and compassion, the moment Diana became one of the people, that system was always going to be on the way out. Not necessarily with Diana, but some time down the line. It was the beginning of the end. And I think with Harry, what we see in the book is this kind of sense, which almost feels to me, as a leftist, what you have is a man born into this, this monarchy, this system, which seems to be at odds with his actual natural senses of justice and wanting to be part of community. I do think I want to make a video about the idea of patriotism and what that means. It means many different things to different people, and I think something Harry does, which you can tell in his book and the way he talks, is that his idea of what he calls patriotism, which would have been a safe way for him to feel part of something and part of his family and something they could share. But the actual vibes I get from the way he describes it, the things that give him hope and strength, are actually a sense of community and brotherhood. Masses of people coming together in a positive way despite their differences. Which is fascinating to see somebody who has that mentality within them. I do believe he has that in him, and I think those are his instinctive values, being raised through a system of hereditary monarchy. So let's look at the Nazi costume. Now, you know that I like to map things back, map systems back. And I think it's a huge disservice to Harry himself for people to imply that he's under the power of Meghan. Of course, that's so sexist and racist against Meghan even to think that. But what you can actually see in Harry, they're trying to present that he's suddenly trying to make himself out to be against racism and he's this liberal, etc. And, he's a hypocrite. But actually, if you look back at his story, you can actually see the journey he's been on. And I think, the very notion that he falls in love with Meghan, and in his mind he is quite naive because he doesn't even consider her ethnicity, her being mixed race to be a problem. I think that comes from a journey he's had. So the Nazi costume in 2005. So Harry was 20 years old, and it was a big news story here, and it should have been a big news story here. I don't think it's something that can be defended, and also to Harry's credit, it's not something he does defend. So what we are looking at is a bunch of very privileged, very financially privileged people with a lot of time on their hands, who are emotionally quite abused and under a lot of stress, who are also completely isolated by design from, the general public and other people, who will never have been taught to question structural racism. Because if they had ever taught William and Harry about systems of power and abuse and structural racism, they might not have had an heir and the monarchy might have ended. I'm deadly serious when I say that. If you start teaching those children anything beyond very, very basic, don't be racist, if you start teaching them the actual systems of how that works and how that presents itself, those boys may well have abandoned the whole system. So I think they will have been deliberately kept very naive. And I don't say that to excuse the behaviour, but I think we're not looking at normal 20-year-olds. They've specifically been groomed into this institution. And the fact that they are groomed into this institution tells me they've not been taught. They've never really had to think about, and this is what Harry says, he says it was an unthinking thing. I mean, to them, it was meaningless. To them, it was a joke. Now, obviously, to normal people in the, in the general public, we would see, it caused a massive scandal, and it should have. And something I do want to get into here, just since we're here, which is, if we look at Nazism, and I don't think anyone was actually suggesting that Harry was a Nazi at all. I think it was a different sort of thing. I think it was more, people couldn't believe the ignorance that somebody in their 20s could not understand, how offensive that would be, because of what the Nazis did and what they represented. And I do think, the more I've been thinking about it, yes, it's quite outrageous. But that party was a natives and colonials party. So the issue was the use of the actual Nazi uniform, which is so ill-advised and awful and offensive. But people didn't really talk much at the time. I tried to look back at some articles. Now, the occasional article, I think I just saw a Guardian one, spoke about the actual fact that this is members of the royal family and people from families that have benefited from colonialism and have made their money on that, are then having a natives and colonials party. That's a theme of their party. It wasn't lost on me that to these people, to this class of people, especially to Harry and to William, they will have been groomed to see that as just a party, right? A party idea, just a fun thing that happened, just something so distant from them. Because again, they can't ever get to a point where they think, actually, let's think about colonialism. Wait, look at our history. Wait a second. They couldn't risk them getting to that point. So that in itself, the idea of a natives and colonials party is just so awful. But let's talk about, just very, very briefly, I want to take a moment to talk about Nazism and the Nazis, because people, when they think about Nazism, I think sometimes people think it was this unique evil which only happened and only could have happened in Germany in the 20s, 30s, 40s. But to be honest, I think that idea is really dangerous and unhelpful, because while it's, you couldn't argue it was anything other than evil, we need to look at how it grew. And unless we educate on that, we're going to see it repeated. And maybe not exactly in the same way that it happened with the Nazis, but it will take another form, as fascism does all over the globe. There are some amazing words about fascism from the writer Michael Rosen, and I just wanted to read you this. I sometimes fear that people think that fascism arrives in fancy dress, worn by grotesques and monsters, as played out in endless reruns of the Nazis. Fascism arrives as your friend. It will restore your honour, make you feel proud, protect your house, give you a job, clean up the neighbourhood, remind you of how great you once were. It will clear out the venal and the corrupt, remove anything you feel is unlike you. It doesn't walk in saying our programme means militias, mass imprisonments, transportations, war and persecution. And the thing that is so frustrating is that, the very outlets that, for example, would identify, a Nazi costume as being racist, will then in their own way contribute to a society which leads us further and further towards a similar sort of fascism. So as Michael Rosen says, I'm sorry, I will get back to the topic, but this is so important I couldn't not say this here. Fascism in Germany, Nazism growing in Germany, came out of a sense of, so there was basically high inflation and the financial situation and poverty in Germany was really bad after World War One. There was the Treaty of Versailles after World War One, and the Germans felt very hard done by. Like, ordinary people, the inflation was so bad, they were like filling up wheelbarrows with money to buy a loaf of bread. And this is a time of, when people feel poverty, as I've said in other videos, people, fascists, people who want to take control and want to become dictators and do want to cause harm, will use a very valid fear, and they will say, we're going to restore your pride. We are going to get rid of those in society who are to blame. Now, in the Nazis' case, that heavily they used the Jews. They said, oh, it's the Jews, they're here, but they're not really us. This level of suspicion about this other coming in, which is nonsensical, because, German Jews were German. They were just Jewish in Germany. But, what they will do, and what we see our tabloids doing here even, the same tabloids that will stand against Nazism, will also try to scaremonger about minorities and not look at the root cause of poverty and inequality. They will push this feeling of national pride. We're better than other nations. They will stoke fears about, degenerate liberals, the depravities of in the Nazi, in that time it was like the Weimar Republic, and these degenerates and progressives. And today we see that in the same sort of vilification of woke snowflakes and all their waging woke war, that kind of idea that liberals and progressives are like degenerates that have to be wiped out of society, and it paints this fairy tale picture of a past which didn't exist, like a pure past. It makes people who feel like they don't have power, like they will find power and brotherhood. I do believe in most people, people have positive feelings towards community, which can be manipulated by fascists and by bad faith actors. Because it's like they used to, for example, in Germany, they would go, look, we'll bring back agriculture. And, it was this idea of, the countryside and bringing back agriculture and our history and our traditions, the idea of simpler times and self-sufficiency. And people are very seduced, here, the Britain myth, we still have this kind of fairy tale picture of British history and empire and how great we were. This idea before these woke snowflakes got hold of us, when it's the woke snowflakes of society, which have given people their rights over the years. But basically it's the idea of making people, unite behind the idea of patriotism, nationalism, but in a way which excludes others. It's so dangerous because people feel powerless and they feel like they don't have pride, and they want something that will give them pride, especially in a society which might be patriarchal. We see this in more British kind of right-wing and fascist thought. We have this idea that to be emotional is like degenerate and weak and leftists and, a whiner. So one way in which men especially can actually express their feelings, actual emotion, the only ways in which it's allowed there and is considered strong would be for Queen and country. Love for your country is where that's allowed to kind of come out. When the Queen died, you were seeing grown men crying, and there's nothing wrong with grown men crying, but it was almost like it was the only acceptable way in patriarchy and in certain groups. That was the only way to show the emotions. So I'm sorry for bringing that up here, but I'm not going to sit here and talk about the Nazi costume without talking about how that happened, and the Nazis, and also what they did and who they attacked. So 6 million Jews were wiped out. So many Jews had to flee and became refugees, and we don't talk about enough the fact that when there were warnings about this, when Nazism was growing, Jewish people were desperately saying, like, can you give us safety, like we're refugees? And we wouldn't take, we kind of just turned a blind eye to it. We didn't really help. We obviously had the Nazis coming for gay men, for the Roma and Sinti people, for Jehovah's Witnesses. There was a mass killing of the disabled, left-wingers put in prison, Polish people, Russians, people believed to be like asocial people that were troublesome. And all these all these kind of these groups, this feeling of, we'll be great again if we get rid of, it's like we'll get rid of the curse, the kind of the stain that we have within us here. And we always put that, and these movements always put that on somebody they deem as an other, because it makes people feel better to put somebody else down. So the top doesn't get scrutinized, and in fact they get more and more power. So this thing widens and more groups get wiped out. And of course, I talk about smear campaigns on this channel. If you look at anti-Semitism around that time, what you're seeing is, the dehumanization of people, making out that they're not real people, they don't have feelings, contradictory ideas. So Jewish people as, bankers and capitalists and making all the money and being so greedy, but then also accused of being socialists and communists. So the smears don't even make sense. It's just repeated smears, and we know the power that these things have. So let's go back on topic. So Harry wears the Nazi uniform. The press see this, and it's in all the papers. Now, what we know from Harry's book, from Harry's perspective, is he says that he basically chose the costume with some help from William and Kate, who also didn't see anything wrong with it, which I can believe. The kind of weird, the class differences, the fact they're not going to be educating them on this stuff. Also, in terms of William, and I will make a video about William's role, there's got to be a certain amount of arrogance to it, because he's got to be this kind of, they're trying to raise him as like this strong leader like the Queen. So in some ways they've kind of taught him as a self-preservation thing not to take all this criticism on board, but I feel like they've also done him a disservice because they've almost made him too arrogant to kind of address genuine concerns. So this is how Harry writes about kind of what happened afterwards. What followed was a firestorm which I thought at times would engulf me. and I felt that I deserved to be engulfed. There were moments over the course of the next several weeks and months when I thought I might die of shame. The typical response to the photos was, what could he have been thinking? The simplest answer was, I wasn't. When I saw those photos, I recognised immediately that my brain had been shut off, that perhaps it had been shut off for some time. I wanted to go around Britain knocking on doors, explaining to people I wasn't thinking, I meant no harm. But it wouldn't have made any difference. Judgment was swift, harsh. I was either a crypto-Nazi or else a mental defective. I turned to Willie. He was sympathetic, but there wasn't much to say. Then I phoned Pa, and to my surprise, he was serene. At first I was suspicious. I thought maybe he was seeing my crisis as another opportunity to bolster his PR. But he spoke to me with such tenderness, such genuine compassion, that I was disarmed and grateful. He didn't gloss over the facts. Darling boy, how could you be so foolish? My cheeks burned. I know. But he quickly went on to say it was the foolishness of youth, that he remembered being publicly vilified for youthful sins, and it wasn't fair, because youth is the time when you're, by definition, unfinished. You're still growing, still becoming, still learning, he said. He didn't specifically cite any of his youthful humiliations, but I knew. His most intimate conversations had been leaked, his most ill-conceived remarks had been trumpeted. Past girlfriends had been interrogated. Their rating of his love-making spread across tabloids, even books. He knew all about humiliation. He promised that the fury about this would blow over, the shame would fade. I loved him for that promise, even though, or maybe because, I knew it to be false. The shame would never fade, nor should it. So something that was very interesting in reading this passage is that I do believe this is somebody who has been quite isolated, has done something racist, and has reacted with shame. Now, something that struck me almost immediately here is that something in Harry's character is not immediately defensive. His immediate response is shame. He said he felt that he deserved to be engulfed. He thought he might die of shame. And I wondered if that's something to do with him being the spare rather than the heir, because it seems like, even for Charles and with William later on, as I'll get to, sorry this is going to be long, but I have so many thoughts on it. What we have with the two that have been raised as the heir seems to be a sort of dismissive arrogance. I think in Charles's case here, it is well-meaning, it genuinely is, but he doesn't seem to, even in his own communication with Harry, and I say this bearing in mind what comes later, not just this situation, he seems to view this as something that was silly of Harry to do, but it will blow over. You have to kind of sort this out in a PR way. He likens it to, he's obviously in his mind likening it to the intrusion in his life, and how he's basically been raised under the microscope, which must have been horrible. But it's also given him a sort of thick skin in the sense that it's made him it seems, unable to take certain criticism, which is a real danger. It doesn't seem Harry has that same thing, and I think it's a mixture of different circumstances. It's a bit of a miracle. I think it's because he's the spare. I think it's because of Diana. I think it's because of his trauma. But the fact that Harry already feels such shame, which is an awful thing, actually is the thing that's going to liberate him and help him grow and change his behaviour and understand more. His father promises that the fury would blow over and that the shame would fade. And obviously that's a father reassuring his son. But there's something in Harry even here. The shame would never fade, nor should it. He's not just thinking in terms of PR, even at this point. He's not just thinking, thank goodness it will blow over and people will forget. He's registering it as a genuine shame. He's registering genuine guilt. The understanding that he's hurt and upset people has upset Harry, and it doesn't seem like that's coming from a PR standpoint. It seems like it's coming from an actual humanity standpoint. Now, he says here that he wanted to go around Britain knocking on doors and explaining to people that I wasn't thinking and that I meant no harm. The constant scrutiny Harry's grown up under, the kind of role of the scapegoat, the fact that although people refer to him often as a narcissist and quite arrogant, he's actually been raised very differently. He's actually been raised as the one that's worth less, not worthless, but worth less than the heir in that system. He seems to quite genuinely want people to think well of him. Not because he just wants to look good, but because it matters to him that he's not perpetuating something that's really harmful. I just do think this is a really fascinating passage in the book, because this feels to me like the very start, the point in Harry's journey, where if this didn't happen, I don't know if we'd have the Harry that we know today. There is something quite miraculous about the fact that this member of the royal family, for some reason, has slipped the net and has actually realised, I've done great wrong and I need to make up for this. His actions were offensive and racist, but there was not racism in his heart, and I think this is what gives him so early on that kind of understanding of bias and systems, and how in order to stop racism, you have to understand the systems. Because Harry himself understands that in his heart he wasn't intending harm, but that didn't matter because he still caused harm, because he was ignorant, because he didn't know about the systems. So what happens next in this period of Harry's life? So he is actually sent to go and meet with the chief rabbi in Britain, and he basically describes how the chief rabbi spoke to him about the horrors of the Holocaust, how he placed, Harry says this, he condemned my actions, he wasn't unkind, but it had to be done. There was no way around it. He also placed my stupidity in a historical context. He spoke about the 6 million, the annihilated Jews, Poles, dissenters, intellectuals, homosexuals, children, babies, old people, turned to ash and smoke, a few short decades ago. I'd arrived at his house feeling shame. I now felt something else, a bottomless self-loathing. But that wasn't the rabbi's aim. That certainly wasn't how he wanted me to leave him. He urged me to not be devastated by my mistake, but instead to be motivated. He spoke to me with the quality one often encounters in truly wise people, forgiveness. He assured me that people do stupid things, say stupid things, but it doesn't need to be their intrinsic nature. I was showing my true nature, he said, by seeking to atone, by seeking absolution. And now I completely agree with this. This is my worldview as well. I think people are not defined by their mistakes and their histories. I think people are defined by what they do once they learn. Once they make the mistake, what do they do? That's when you find out what's in somebody's heart. How do they react? Do they react with anger at the criticism and take it personally and make it about arrogance? Or do they actually listen and take it in and try to make those changes in their life to make sure that nothing like that happens again? But even the way Harry talks about this, you know, about how he was condemned and it wasn't unkind, but it had to be done. This is a man who's basically not sitting there like so many white people will do this when it comes to race. You know, I think we've all experienced this. They will get so defensive and angry. And even being told about the context of racism, even when somebody is saying to them, it's okay, I know you didn't mean badly, but this is the context, they get so angry and defensive. I'm not saying that it's always, if someone says something is racist, that it always is racist. You know, we live in a world where bad faith actors sometimes do weaponize things like that. You know, and we have to be really careful about that, especially now in the modern age where you're seeing these kind of progressive talking points used to smear people and attack people who actually are progressive, which is a horrible development. But are people willing to at least listen? I think to me that's so important. Harry describes his stupidity, you know, he says it about his stupidity. And he talks about how the rabbi manages in his mind to place it within historical context. This, for me, is a turning point in Harry's life, and this is how Harry has become the sort of figure that he is today, why he's interested in kind of structural racism and why he stands by Meghan. I feel like this is such a formative experience, and I haven't really seen many people talking about it in much depth. This is also the time when he realises that his own shame and sense of self-loathing, first of all, it's not helpful because it doesn't help fix the problem, and this is something he realises and comes to terms with. It also, I think, gives him that moment of realising that his low self-esteem. Now, when people have low self-esteem, we know a lot of people who are abused go on to abuse other people. If you have low self-esteem, sometimes you can lash out and hurt other people because you're so vulnerable. This is where it seems Harry kind of deviates from the rest of his family, because he acknowledges the devastation, but the devastation he feels becomes part of his own sense of his own humanity. It's not an attack. He's not thinking, I feel ashamed, therefore I'm not going to take criticism. He's thinking, I feel shame because I've upset people, but do you know what I can do to help? Is learn, you know, is to try and be better. This is such a formative moment for Harry. And also, it's really interesting. This is somebody who struggles with, you know, he says bottomless self-loathing, and this is something that would have been taught to him over time. As a scapegoat in a family system, you will struggle with feelings of shame, loathing, unworthiness. Your mistakes will not feel to you like a normal mistake. They can feel to you, because in the past, if you've made a mistake, for example, in childhood, you've been disproportionately attacked, you know, it can get you into a state of feeling like making any mistake makes you the evil, bad person that your caregivers or the people around you, or in Harry's case, the media, have kind of set him up as. So it's this horrible, horrible cycle. And I'd even say that in people like William's situation, like the golden child, there is also an inner kind of sense of self-loathing. I think in abusers there is, I think we can't really deny that. But what Harry learns here is he says he's going to lift his head, go forth, and use this experience to make the world better. And this is where Diana's coming in here, because this is at odds with everything the royal family teaches. This is where Harry is starting to learn that you must learn your history. You can't appreciate the present without learning your histories, and in doing that, you're learning the structures. Harry's mistake, his stupid mistake that he made, which was offensive, he realises wasn't done out of a hatred. For example, he didn't do it because he hates Jewish people or because he wants to show support for the Nazis. He's able to then contextualise, okay, so then how do we stop this kind of thing happening? It's about education. It's about education and it's about awareness, because that's what I lacked. I lacked that education in actually thinking about how these experiences are for other people, because we're so isolated. Okay, so now we're going to skip forward in time. So we're gonna get to the point where Harry has met Meghan, fallen in love with Meghan. Their relationship has become public knowledge, and the attacks have begun. Okay. In those first hours and days of November 2016, there was a new low every few minutes. I was shocked and scolded myself for being shocked and for being unprepared. I'd been braced for the usual madness, the standard libels, but I hadn't anticipated this level of unrestrained lying. Above all, I hadn't been ready for the racism, both the dog whistle racism and the glaring, vulgar, in-your-face racism. Now, even just this comment shows an understanding in Harry that racism comes in different forms. This is something that the rest of his family, to my knowledge, seem to lack an awareness of. Harry mentions the Daily Mail saying that Meghan's straight out of Compton and that she has a gang-scarred home. There's a headline from another tabloid saying that Harry is to marry gangster royalty. He says, this is Harry's reaction. My face froze, my blood stopped. I was angry, but more ashamed. My mother country doing this to her, to us, really. And apparently the Mail then went on to talk about the different crimes that had happened in Compton, even though Meghan had never lived in Compton. Boris Johnson's sister, who writes for the Mail. And yeah, if you're not from Britain, then yeah, a lot of these people are connected. You may wonder, how come these people all know each other? Because the system's set out that way. If you're related to somebody in it, it's much easier to get in to the system. And she suggests that Meghan would do something genetically to the royal family. She says, if there is issue from her alleged union with Prince Harry, the Windsors will thicken their watery, thin blue blood and Spencer pale skin and ginger hair with some rich and exotic DNA. This woman also said that Doria was from the wrong side of the tracks. And Harry describes this depiction and this racism as this filth. And actually it's something that a lot of these people have said. I believe Rachel Johnson, the sister of Boris Johnson, has said, I wasn't saying it as a bad thing. It wasn't a bad thing. My intent wasn't bad. It wasn't really racist. Well, to talk about someone's actual blood being different, right? Someone's exotic DNA takes us into worrying places, their blood's different. It's thicker. It's exotic. The idea of polluting blood, that very idea is really, really harmful. So Harry desperately wants to do something to put a stop to this. He says, I felt wild with rage and guilt. I'd infected Meg and her mother with my contagion, otherwise known as my life. I'd promised her I'd keep her safe, and I'd already dropped her into the middle of this danger. When I wasn't with the lawyer, I was with Kensington Palace comms person, Jason. He was very smart, but a tad too cool about this unfolding crisis for my liking. He urged me to do nothing. You're going to feed the beast. Silence is the only option. But silence wasn't an option. Of all the options, silence was the least desirable, the least defensible. And this is why I wanted to talk about the Nazi costume incident, because it seems like through his life experiences, Harry is understanding that silence is betrayal. To be silent when you have the power to stop an injustice, when racism's happening. He's understanding that racism is not just the general invasive, nasty things that the tabloids are doing, which are also very wrong. But he's also understanding, as a white person himself, that it's different when it's racism. This is a danger not just to Meghan and to their children in the future, but to people reading it. It's actually spreading hatred and it's dangerous. So Harry's desperately trying to convince them to do something about this, to put out some sort of statement, but the courtiers blocked him. Nothing can be done, they said, and therefore nothing will be done. So Harry uneasily accepts this. And then he reads an essay in the Huffington Post. He says, "The essayist said that the mild reaction of Britons to this explosion of racism was to be expected, since they were the heirs of racist colonialist. But what was truly unforgivable," she added, "was my silence. Mine. I showed the essay to Jason, said we needed a course correction immediately. No more debate and no more discussion. We needed a statement out there. Within a day we had a draft. Strong, precise, angry and honest. I didn't think it would be the end, but maybe the beginning of the end. I read it one last time and asked Jason to let it fly." So in response to this essay, so Harry's been fighting behind the scenes because he recognises racism. In response to the essay, rather than becoming angry, rather than becoming entitled and thinking, how dare you, I've actually been doing all this, how can you say this? He's got beyond that. He's not making it personal. He's actually agreed with it. He's read that criticism, listened to it and thought, you know what, you're right. To be silent is complicity. So he's overruled the palace. This is a big move for somebody who's grown up there. He's decided no matter what happens, I'm going to do this because it's the right thing to do. He understands that his silence here, as a white man of power in the royal family, is unforgivable. Okay, and this is the fascinating part here. In fact, my statement generated a whole new onslaught from my family. Pa and Willie were furious. They gave me an earful. My statement made them look bad, they both said. Why in hell? Because they'd never put out a statement for their girlfriends or wives when they were being harassed. So what we see there is we have that kind of defensive guilt which turns to stubbornness, which turns to anger. For the heirs, it seems they've been raised to care more about their image than justice. Oh yeah, sure, it's the morally right thing to do, if they even think it's the morally right thing to do, stand up against racism. I mean, I don't know. But to them, the PR is more important. To be silent is more important. And basically, Harry has shown them up. They are angry because he's said, no, I am not going to stand for this injustice and I see the racism and I'm going to speak about it. It gets worse and worse. So when it's getting to an extent where Meghan is in danger, physically and also mental health wise, he's desperate. Harry's desperate. He says, not knowing where to turn, I phoned Pa. And his advice is, don't read it, darling boy. It's not that simple, I said angrily. And he describes how Meghan, is having panic attacks now. She's having a breakdown. She hasn't raised the blinds for months. And he's told by Charles that he's overreacting, that this is sadly the way it is. Harry understands this is not the way it is, it's not the way it should be, but he's also so angry that the royals, this face of Britain and patriotism, because at this point Harry still seems to have a lot of faith in patriotism. And in the monarchy, I mean, I'll make a video about that soon, about Harry's views on the monarchy. I feel like instinctively he's actually leaning against the idea of monarchy, but I think it's difficult because he's grown up in it. His instincts seem to actually be much more community-based, much more equality-based. Essentially, the plea that's coming through here that he's desperately trying to make to his dad, which is so tragic, it's very simple. There is more than our experience. Dad, this is about more than us. This is about more than our experience. This is bigger. This is hurting other people. This is racism. We need to put the PR aside. That doesn't matter. We have to do what's right. And that, of course, puts Harry on a collision course with the very idea of monarchy and the firm itself. Because the firm itself cannot possibly get into discussions about structural racism, because then the very idea of the monarchy would fall apart. And there's this kind of really hopeless section which makes you very angry as a reader, which is where he's just constantly trying to look after Meghan, seeing her fall apart, seeing the tabloids get away with this, seeing his family just completely allow it to happen. And it's even more dark when you think, what we know now of his suspicions or his belief that people in the family have actually allowed Meghan to be sacrificed for this reason. So, directly playing into racism. And all he's getting is just, don't read it, darling, from his father. And he keeps being told, well, it happened to Camilla, it happened to Kate. And he says here, the implication being what? Now it was Meg's turn? As if it were apples to apples. So in Harry, again, you've got these ideas that, first of all, and this is why I honestly believe he's going to end up as an anti-monarchist, his basic principles here are that we can do better than the past, we can change. Just because something bad has happened to somebody doesn't mean that we have to keep perpetuating that and continuing a system if it's unjust and it's unfair. So that's the first principle we see here. The second here, this idea is as if it were apples to apples. He's basically understanding that the terrible things that Camilla and Kate have got, which he does talk about in the book, are not comparable because with Meghan there is the added element of racism. He talks about dog whistles, he's not just saying people aren't openly racist in the sense that they'll call her, I mean, some people are on social media, they'll be really overtly racist, but what they're really doing is they are attacking her with such glee dehumanizing her like she's no longer a person, using all these implications, and that is steeped in the racism of our society and the racism that exists in Britain. You know, I do think it's really remarkable, because I think he's still on a journey at this point. I don't think he's quite left-leaning enough to satisfy me at this point. But we have this one guy, this brave little boy who has become a brave man, who is questioning systems and is somehow, by some miracle, courageous enough that he continues to speak out against them. And this is despite being raised with severe, there's severe emotional abuse, and there's a lot of control in that family, being stalked, anxiety, something in Harry, and this is why I have a lot of time for him, is still saying, this is wrong, it needs to change. He's not thinking about himself or even the institution. It's very simple to Harry in that moment, and when he decides to put the statement out, racism is wrong, therefore we speak against it. It's very, very simple for him, and it kind of cuts through the bureaucracy of the firm. Now, at the great Buckingham Palace summons that Harry has after he's been battling this absolutely desperately for a long time, he's absolutely desperate, and he says, "We wouldn't have had to do it if you'd protected us and protected the monarchy in the process. You're doing a disservice to yourselves by not protecting my wife." He said, "I looked around the table, stony faces. Was it incomprehension, cognitive dissonance, a long-term mission at play? Or did they really not know? Were they so deep inside a bubble that they really hadn't fully appreciated how bad things were?" For instance, Tatler magazine, quoting an old Etonian, saying I'd married Meg because foreigners, like her, are easier than girls with the right background. Or the Daily Mail saying Meg was upwardly mobile because she'd gone from slaves to royalty in just 150 years. Or the social media posts about her being a yacht girl and an escort, and calling her a gold digger and a and a and a and the N-word repeatedly. Some of these posts were in the comments section on the pages of all three Palace's social media accounts, and still hadn't been expunged. Or the tweet that said, "Dear Duchess, I'm not going to say that I hate you, but I hope your next period happens in a shark tank." Or the revelation of racist texts from Jo Marnie, girlfriend of UKIP leader Henry Bolton, including one saying that my black American fiancé would taint the royal family, setting the stage for a black king, and another saying this is Britain, not Africa. Things have got so out of hand that 72 women in Parliament from both main parties had condemned the colonial undertones of the newspaper coverage of the Duchess of Sussex. None of these things had merited one comment, public or private, from my family. I knew how they rationalised it all, saying it was no different from what Camilla had got, or Kate, but it was different. One study looked closely at 400 vile tweets about Meg. Employing a term of data specialists and computer analysts, the study found that this avalanche of hate was wildly atypical, light years from anything directed at Kate or Camilla. A tweet calling Meg the Queen of Monkey Island had no historical precedent or equivalent. He then talks about Meghan receiving a package of suspicious white powder that had been sent to their office with a racial note attached. And it's in this meeting that it finally feels like Harry understands quite horribly that there's no progressing and there's no good faith. Because unfortunately, what it seems like to me is that Harry really believed that these people were like him before, and that they were ignorant, operating in good faith, but just ill-equipped to handle it. And I think what he's actually had to realise over time, which is so devastating, is that actually they are complicit in the racism. At least they won't stand up against it. And they can't seem to understand that them not standing up against it makes them part of it. You know, it's the fact that the PR, the system, will always come before anything. It will come before the individuals in it. Any of them, even the heirs. It will come before the family members. It will come before what is right and what is good, and before the people. It reminds me of a scene in The Crown, actually. A scene where Charles is young, and he says of his family that they mean well, and he's told, I believe by Wallace Simpson, I'm not sure. She says very chillingly, no, they don't. As in, they don't mean well for you. As in, the brand, the PR, the institution will come before you, even if they care about you. I do think that's the terrible realisation that Harry's had, really. I hope this is kind of coherent. I know it's very long. I have so many thoughts on it, and there's so much more I could have said, but I just kind of wanted to choose the things that felt the most impactful to me. I think it definitely is worth looking at how Harry ended up here, all the factors at play, and I think potentially why William has turned out the opposite way. If you're raised as the heir, if you have to be you're head of a brand. If you're raised as the heir, you have to believe that you're above people. You have to be kept at a distance from people. You know, you're not on their level. There is no way that William can, and maybe he knows this, maybe he's aware of this, maybe he's not. There is no way that he can get into conversations as heir and as his role, which is to continue the monarchy. That's his one job, isn't it? To keep the monarchy going, to not let it fall under him. If it doesn't fall with Charles, which I hope it will, he can't be getting into conversations about structural inequality and racism. And maybe he knows that. Maybe in some ways Harry is naive, because Harry does seem to at the moment still think that, you know, he's pro-monarchy in his mind. I'm still pro-monarchy, but maybe in some ways William, or at least his advisors, have realised that actually no, the path of looking at structural inequality will lead to the destruction of this inherently unjust and structurally unequal system. I will also say, in William's defence, psychologically speaking, not in defence of the fact that he's a grown adult who's allowing racism to happen, but the way he will have been trained and taught and groomed in by the family and by his grandmother will be to try and emulate the Queen, you know, because she's seen as doing something. I think she's been very successful in what she's done. But he will have been taught that he's got to be strong enough to withstand a storm. And the way it worked with his grandmother in that generation is not going to cut it now. But they don't seem to realise it, the firm. They're still operating under the idea that, like with Elizabeth, bad press will come and go. But ultimately, if you're more quiet, you know, the press will put out that you're dignified and calm, and it will eventually blow over. To me, that's a fundamental misunderstanding of the modern world and what people want and need. I think what he's trying to do, or what the team around him might be trying to do, is to make him seem like his grandmother, like he's dignified and withstanding something. But even that in itself is quite offensive when you look at racism, especially what we understand of racism now, which is that silence is complicity. And in some ways you could say that William's in an impossible spot, and Charles is also groomed into this system, because in order to be good human beings, to follow the ethos of decency, empathy, equality, compassion, democracy, they can't do those things while they are the mascot of the royal family, because the royal family stands against those ideas. I'm sure they will have taught William never be ruled by the press or the tabloids, just let them say whatever they want. Which in some ways has also cursed this man, because I'm sure he's being advised to act in the way that he is, and I'm sure he's also, you know, complicit in part of it at this point. And I'm sure the people around him who believed that his mother was too messy and too emotional and too close to people and was unstable will be talking, you know, they'll be whispering in his ear, and I'm sure they have done since he was a child, since he lost Diana. I think there's a sense that the monarch doesn't negotiate, because the monarch has to be above the people. The monarch isn't accountable to the people, which doesn't make sense, because they say the monarch's meant to serve the people. But again, it gets to the basic ideas that monarchy isn't fair or just because it's an unelected leader. I think the play is to try and keep William, and Kate too, because they're branding them, above politics, right? To keep them neutral. That can't work in this modern age, and it certainly can't work when a member of your family is mixed race and is experiencing racism. That makes you complicit, because if you're in that position, if you're not brave enough to at least say, stop being racist, and in fact you actively try to get other people talking about racism to be quiet and to smear them, you're worse than useless, because you're actually perpetuating the whole system. So I think, to leave this on a more optimistic note, I think what we can learn from this story, and looking at Harry, for example, and people like that, is that there's a way back. People aren't their histories. We all will have bias. We'll all have been formed by the society in which we lived and the people that were around us. But what matters is what we decide as adults. Do we decide to educate ourselves further and learn and grow? How do we react when we do something which hurts other people, even if we don't mean it to? Do we, after a mistake, want to make the world a better and fairer place? Or do we choose ego just to try and escape blame? I think there's huge hope when you see someone like Harry. If it's possible that somebody raised into the royal family, somebody that isolated with that much trauma, who has been that controlled over the years, in that whole environment, if it's possible that boy, that little boy, has somehow made it to this place, I believe it's possible for anyone. I truly, truly do. Obviously, I think there's a way to go. I think, you know, true justice and equality would be to move away from the actual idea of monarchy itself. But I think we should take heart in that whole situation, because it is a miracle. It is a miracle, and I hope that mapping it back, we can kind of see exactly how that's happened. And I hope anyone watching this who themselves feels, you know, maybe you've had a difficult life and you've suffered abuse, or you've been brought up with beliefs that you now don't necessarily believe in. I hope it gives you the strength to know that, you know, you're not your past and you're not those things that you were taught. And there's a way to define yourself and to learn and to keep moving and growing and progressing. And, you know, it's never too late. It is never too late to do that. I truly believe that. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. This is really, really long. But yeah, longer than my usual ones, but I hope you enjoy. Let me know what you think. All right, I love you, and I will see you really soon. And fingers crossed. I tend to think that there's a huge backlash right now, right? They're trying to smear Harry and Meghan and silence them and shut them up and frighten them, because I think they know that this is the end for the monarchy. You know, these conversations, this information. I think they're frightened because Harry's story might actually embolden people who wouldn't be the traditional anti-racist, right? People who've grown up maybe in a situation that is racist. He's dangerous because they might look at him and think, do you know what? Maybe actually I can change and grow, and that doesn't have to define me, and maybe I can actually stand up with people and find community with others as an equal. You know, that's the threat, and that's partly why they're smearing him. But the fact they are smearing him so badly means that it's a genuine threat, because there's people like that out there. And hopefully we're going to see more and more and more of them. And we can be part of it too. We can be constantly learning and growing and helping other groups. So, love you loads, and I'll see you really, really soon. Okay, love you. Bye.